and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in this video we're going to work or continue to work on the SU carburetor, and more specifically preparing for the actual tuning of that carburetor. In the previous video we took the car for a spin, we recorded all the FR readings, and we did see a lot of issues with this carburetor. In this video we're going to prepare for the tuning of it, but first of all we will have to understand on how this carburetor is working, because without an understanding there is no way we can actually tune a carburetor. And those of you that have seen the previous video, you recognize the curve here on the screen. Now that curve was recorded while we were test driving the car. We went through the acceleration phases, first, second, third, fourth gear, we went into cruising mode, and then finally we went to wide open and we backed off. And what we've seen throughout the whole curve is that the carburetor was not providing the right amount of air and fuel mixture. The carburetor, in other words, is not tuned to the car. So tuning a carburetor is very essential, and you need to tune it to your specific car, to your specific needs. It is not just about adjusting the AFR on a idle running motor. It is not just about setting your idle RPM. There's a lot more to it, and you really need to tune it for your specific car. But of course, you can't start tuning if you don't know how the carburetor is working. And therefore, we're going to start to talk about the SU carburetor. The carburetor that is fitted on my Mini, but it doesn't really matter for what car it is the SU HIF 44. And the HIF stands for the fact that the flow chamber is underneath the carburetor and not besides it. But we're going to go through all the different settings and adjustments that you can do, and it doesn't really matter where the float is located. Is it underneath or is it on the side? It doesn't really matter, because all these carburetors work exactly in the same way. We're going to take it apart, and we're going to be looking at all the different components. And then we're going to start talking on how that affects the curve, on how we can correct the curve that we recorded, on how we can correct and tune this carburetor. But before doing so, I like to take you through some very basic principles of a SU carburetor. What I drew up here is the basic diagram of an SU carburetor. And an SU carburetor is a carburetor that works with a variable venturi. When we refer to venturi, we mean the flow from the incoming air into the engine and how wide that opening is, that kind of tube effect. Now in other carburetors, so the non-SU types, you will find an area which is going to narrow, like so. And that's a fixed area. We call this typically the main venturi. And when air flows through this, air will accelerate in this area. And that's how you create a venturi effect. Now with an SU carburetor, none of that is valid. That doesn't exist, because we have a variable venturi. And the way that is done is by having a piston right here. This is the piston, which can move up and down in the dashpot. And because it can move up and down, it's going to enlarge or make this opening smaller. So we have a variable venturi. That's the main difference. The good thing about this mechanism is that you only need one jet. Where other carburetors with a fixed venturi typically have a idle jet, an acceleration jet, a cruising jet, and a wide open jet. So and of course an emulsion tube. We don't need any of this on an SU carburetor. All what we need to have is a single variable jet. Now on the piston we have a needle. And this is the needle. And that needle is tapered. It's very thin at the bottom and very thick at the top. When the piston is in its rest position, it's all the way down, over here. So actually blocking the passage for the air. And the needle goes all the way in the jet. And because the needle is tapered, thicker there, it starts to reduce the opening in between the needle and the actual jet itself. So if the piston moves up, then the needle moves up, and the thinner part of the needle is now inside the jet. And therefore, we are now having more space around the needle for fuel to come out. Now the mechanism to get the piston upwards depends on the throttle position. So if we are running on idle, then the piston is really all the way on the bottom, and the piston is pushed down by a spring which you have inside. This kind of funny thing right here is the spring, and that spring will push the piston down So when the engine is at idle, we can adjust the air-fuel mixture for idle by actually lowering the jet itself up and down. And that's done through a screw that you have on the side of your carburetor. So you can move the jet up and down a bit to adjust your idle AFR. All right, so now assuming we are running on idle. So when you run on idle, typically the gas throttle is closed. But as soon as we start to accelerate, the gas throttle will open up to a certain position, and thereby the engine is starting to suck in air. It's going to need air. And because it's sucking in air, we're going to create a depression here. And the way that is done is there's a hole in this piston, and I'll show you that in a few minutes, and that hole will allow air to be sucked out from the top of the piston and thereby creating a depression. And the bottom side of the piston, which is facing the air intake, is actually having an opening and is having atmospheric air. So because we have a depression on the top of the piston now, the piston is going to move up. And how far it will move up depends on the positioning of the gas throttle. And that, of course, then is affecting the opening on the jet here. So once the piston is moving up, then we can get more air coming through. We get the Venturi effect. We have a serious opening, and then we're filling the engine. However, there is a bit of a problem. If this piston is moving upwards too fast, then this opening here will become too big in one go. And the result of that is that we're going to lose air speed. So we won't have enough air speed anymore. And then, if we don't have enough airspeed, not enough fuel will come in. So now we're having really a problem. Now, to avoid this kind of problem, there are two things that are holding back the piston a bit. First of all, there is a spring. But the spring really has more effect on the wide open. But the other part that we have to reduce the piston moving upwards violently is a damper. So on the top of your SU carburetor, you will find a damper. And the damper is nothing more than a shock absorber, really. And you'll see that. So it's going to allow the piston to come up, but not very quickly. It's going to hold back a bit. That's typically what dampers do. It will also avoid the piston being dancing. You know, sometimes you could have a dancing piston if you have no oil in the damper, and the piston will go up and down a little bit based on the engine rhythm. So that's another issue for which we do have a damper. Now imagine now that we have now accelerated and that the piston has lifted to the proper position whereby we still have sufficient air speed, and the opening on the needle and the jet is sufficient, then the car will properly accelerate. If that is not the case, the car will hesitate to accelerate. If we now move the throttle to wide open, then the piston should fly up all the way to the top to get all this fuel in. But again, it cannot do this immediately. It will be held back a bit by the damper, so that we can have sufficient rich mixture initially to have that acceleration. It should move all the way to the top. If it doesn't, then there is a problem. If the piston isn't able to move on wide open to the top, then the spring is most likely too strong, and then you have to get a lighter spring. But we'll talk about this later. And if the piston is already on the top before you're in wide open, then the spring is too soft. So these are the things we now can adjust. So the things to deal with now is the damper. That's an adjustment we need to do. And some people will use different grade of oil to change the effect of the damper. So the thicker the oil, the more effect the damper has. The thinner the oil, the less effect the damper has. The other thing we need to look at is the spring, right? We can also adjust the spring, and that's typically for wide open. And then there's an interesting part, which is the needle. The needle can be changed out, and so can be the jet. The needle consists of about 300 different types of needles. And that's something we'll look into once we start tuning. The needles by themselves has what they are called stations. And these are marked areas on the needle for specific purposes. So the stations can differ depending on your application. All right, so now let's take a carburetor apart and look at all these things in practice. So here you have the SU carburetor. On this side you typically find your air filter, which is attached to it. This is the dashpot that I referred to, and inside the dashpot you'll have what we call the damper, and this is the damper. And don't worry, we'll take it all apart. On the bottom you'll find your flow chamber. On the side you find your choke and your accelerator. And over here you can actually see the butterfly that can open up and close depending on your throttle position and your gas pedal. And this is the side that typically goes to the engine. Over here you have a small connector, which is your vacuum and fans for your distributor. You have another vacuum connector right here, typically for your gases coming out of your carter. And then on the bottom here you have your fuel line. All right, so if you look closely inside, you can actually see the piston. You see that? All right, so let's take it apart. So we're going to start by taking off the dashpot of the carburetor. But before we do so, it is always interesting to know exactly what kind of a carburetor that you have. And typically you will find a tag on your carburetor somewhere around the dashpot. And this is the tag identifying the type of carburetor that you can look up on the SU reference manuals. There are 3 screws on the dashpot to remove. So I already removed 2, so now we're going to remove the last one. But before I do so, I will first remove the damper, which is just turning it out and then lifting it out. Some dampers will have a seal here, others won't. So the ones with a seal would have a venting hole. The ones without the seal have no venting hole. So let me put that aside, and then we remove finally the bolt, and put that aside. There we go. And now we can lift the pot up, and normally the piston will come with it because the piston is held in place on the top with this little circlip here. Now I already removed it to make it a bit easier, but I'll show you where that fits. So now we can lift that up like so. And then we have inside the dashpot, and remember, keep the dashpot always together with the piston. That's very important. Inside we have the spring, and you will get more explanations on the spring. The spring typically has a certain spring load, and they come in different types and sizes. And I can't see the color anymore on this one after I cleaned it, but I think this must have been a red one. It's still a little bit visible. The different colors identify the strength of the spring, and again you need to look that up in the SU catalog. All right, so let me move the spring aside, and now I can actually lift out the piston. There we go. Now on the top of the piston you will find a groove. See that groove? And that's where this circlip is fitting, so it prevents the piston falling out of the dashpot. So let me lift now the piston, and here we go, and you can see how that lifts up and down. You can't misfit the piston because there's a groove and a guide on the carburetor. So this is the side facing the air intake or the air filter. And of course here we have the needle, but I'll come back to the needle in a few more minutes. What is important is that you keep the dashpot always together with the piston. That is very important, that they go together. And you'll see why in a minute, because we will need to do a drop test on the piston, especially if you're going to have multiple carburetors on the same engine. So that was taking apart the dashpot. Pretty easy to do, nothing to it. And now we have total visibility inside, and we can see the main jet, or the only jet we have in this carburetor actually. And of course we can look through the carburetor for the opening when the gas throttle is open. This is a 44, and the 44 refers to the actual opening here, so this is 44 millimeters. They come in different sizes, so if you see a HIF 44, it means 44 millimeters diameter. All right, that tube right here is attached to the piston, and the damper goes inside. And that's a tube you need to fill up with oil, and you have to get oil of the right viscosity. So if the oil is too thick, then the damping effect will be too strong. If the oil is too thin, then you're not going to get a good damping effect. And both have a problem. Both have a different symptom. If the oil is too thin, then the piston will move up too early during acceleration. And that if that happens, then we're losing air velocity. And the car will be hesitant to speed up. Exactly what we had with this Mini when we tested it. If there's no oil in it, then it's even worse. If the oil is too thick in it, then you're going to get some acceleration initially with the right mixture, but the piston isn't going to move up fast enough, so you don't get enough volume into the cylinders of the car to accelerate. So both are a problem. So you got to make sure that you have the right oil. Now, I would recommend the SU monograde oil for that, and I think it's an SAE20 if I'm not mistaken. But you can try different oils while you are trying to tune your carburetor. All right, so let me pull this out and place it aside. Right, so now let's have a closer look on this piston. Let's pull it out and see what that is. So this is the needle, and as you can see, this needle can move around. And this is what we call the self-centering needle. You find this on the HIF 44 carburetors. On other carburetors you may not find it, and the needle is actually fixed. And you will need to adjust the jet so that the jet comes right in the middle of that needle. So there's an equal space around the needle. But on this carburetor you don't need to worry about this. You can remove the needle, and you will see there's a little spring inside because the needles come in different sizes. And you can already see that the needle is tapered, very small on the top and getting thicker and thicker to the bottom. And as I said before, when you buy a needle, they will define all stages. These are all stations, sorry, not stages, but stations. There's about 10, I believe, stations on that. And these are different regions on the needle that actually will behave differently. In other words, depending on the station, the thickness of that, on how your car, your engine is running, you're going to have a richer or leaner mixture. So that's why you might want to have a different needle when you're tuning your car. But we come back to that. The other thing that you see right here on this piston is two holes. And remember when I mentioned that the air which is being sucked in from the engine through the carburetor is going through these holes, this vacuum. And these are the two holes, these are the two vacuum holes that are leading to the top of the piston. You can actually see that, you see them coming out there, these two holes. And that's where the depression or the vacuum is created inside the dashpot so that the piston can actually move up. So these two holes are always facing towards the engine block or the intake manifold. You can't mount the piston wrong because there is a kind of a cutout which is sliding into a locking plate onto the carburetor body itself. So one other thing we need to talk about this is that the piston should be sliding nicely into the housing or the dashpot. And what you should do is to tape off those two holes and then do a drop test of that piston. So you put it in there and then you let it come out, and you should feel some resistance. I'll do the drop test in a few minutes with you so you can see what I mean. The drop test is extremely important if you have multiple carburetors, and never mix the piston with the dashpot because normally they are paired to each other, they are machined towards each other. Removing the needle is easy. There's a screw right here on that piston which you can undo, and then the needle will come out. You don't need to take it completely out, but you see there's some debris on it, and now the needle will actually come out. And this one is a bit sticky. There we go. Now the needle, if you need to put it back, it has a little slot there where the screw should go in, and it has a spring. Now all needles have a number, and it's marked on the stem right here on that needle. And that's the kind of number you need to reference to if you need to have another one. And for that, you have an SU needle catalog to find out which one you need. So that's the screw that's holding the needle in place through that hole right there. So that fits typically in there, and then you can hold the needle, and the needle will sit in this opening. Now, if you look on the needle, there is a spring, so you've got to make sure the spring is on, and this is the holder, and the cutout in the holder fits exactly where that screw sits to hold it. Now, if you put the needle back in, you have to make sure that it's sitting flush with the bottom side of the actual piston. Now, the needle is a sensitive device, so be always very careful with it. So let me move that in there, making sure it lines up nicely. There we go. And I want to have it flush. And then we put the screw in. And we lock it gently into place. Now I need to push it back a bit so that it sits flush. So the holder always needs to sit flush. Alright, there we go. And that's it. And the needle should be able to move a bit, but that's only on this specific carburetor. Other carburetors you will have to center the jet. So we're going to do the drop test. And the drop test is really all about putting the piston into the dash pot, push it up, and then let it drop down. And see that it drops properly, not too fast, not too slow. And if you have multiple pots like this, or multiple carburetors actually, you should do it on both, and do it at the same time on both, and make sure that they fall in sync. That's very important. If you only have one carburetor, then the speed of dropping isn't all that important. But if you do it on dual carburetors or quattro carburetors, then make sure they are in sync. That's very important. It's best to remove the needle because otherwise you may damage it. So I'm going to put a piece of cloth here, so when it drops down it's going to drop soft, or semi-soft I would say. The way to test it is by taping off these holes here. Remember, those holes are the holes that are feeding the depression to the top of the piston to bring it upwards, so we need to block those off, and for that just use a bit of tape. Make sure you can remove the tape afterwards, and let me stick on the tape. Nothing really special, just ordinary tape. And also the sides. My tape is not the best tape in the world, but it will work and it will do the job. Alright, so make sure it's kind of airtight. Paper tape works pretty well as well, but I'm a bit too lazy to go and get it. Alright, so nicely taped up so it doesn't leak. So now let's put it in the pot and see what happens. If you do this test, don't use oil, don't use a spring, just the bare dash pot, nothing else. Slide it in there and then let it go. See, it takes a bit of time to come down, and that's what you should have. So if you have two, hold both of them and let both go at the same time. And they should fall out at a steady pace. They shouldn't be blocking, they shouldn't be holding back. That's the drop test. So now we are looking from the top of the carburetor, and this is where the piston would slide in normally. And all the way on the bottom, right there, that's where the jet is. And the jet will have a certain size, and you can have different jets. Now that jet can be moved up and down with the idle adjustment screw. Let me get a screwdriver and show you that. So the jet adjustment screw is right on the side, and I'm going to turn that up and down a bit, and you see it moving? Hopefully you can see it, how that moves up and down. Alright, so this is the adjustment you will do on an idle running engine. Move that jet up, Move the jet down. And that will affect your air-fuel mixture at idle. So now you're looking from the side of the carburetor, and inside you have the jet. And I'm going to slide in the needle just to show you how the needle goes down into the jet while the piston goes down, and how that opens up again, and how much more play we get when the piston is moving up. Now the jet itself can be raised or lowered, and the way to do that is by the adjustment screw for the idle air-fuel mixture on the side. So I'm going to turn it, and hopefully you can see it. I'm going to turn it up. You see that coming up? There we go. There it goes. I'm going to take it back down, and that's how you can adjust your idle AFR. It's one of the basic settings you need to do before tuning the carburetor. So far you've seen a bit on how the carburetor works. We have taken the dash pot off the carb, we took the piston out, we looked on the needle, we looked on the spring, and we looked on the damper, but of course there are more components on this carburetor than just that. But if you're going to need parts for your carburetor, and I forgot to mention that, you should be looking for a tag, and this is a tag, and a tag is typically mounted around the dash pot. That's where you would find the tag, and the tag will tell you what type of a carburetor it is, and with that you can find all the right parts. If you don't have the tag anymore, it can become a little bit more difficult, but sometimes you find it stamped on the carburetor itself. So the next thing we're going to do is to look at the float chamber, and on this carburetor the float chamber is all the way on the bottom. Other carburetors actually have it on the side, but the principle is always the same. You won't find too much inside there. All you're going to find there is of course a float and a needle, and then the main jet, and actually you'll see the mechanism on how to adjust the idle AFR or the idle mixture. Alright, so let's open that up and have a closer look. So I turned the carburetor upside down, and this is the float chamber. There's 4 screws to undo. I already undid 3 of them, and I will undo this one. And then you can take the cover off, and there's nothing special on the cover, it's just a seal. But pay attention that the indented part should actually be sitting where the float is sitting, so the white part. So let us take a closer look now on the float chamber. With the cover removed, we can actually see 3 parts. There is the float needle underneath this part, there's the float itself, and there is the main jet. Believe it or not, this is the feed for the main jet. In fact, there's only one jet, and this little tube is going down all the way inside to the jet we looked at. That's just a holder, and on the side you will find an adjustment screw. And I'm going to try to turn that so you can actually see that moving. Alright, so I'm going to move that up and down a bit. See that moving? Hopefully you can see it. We looked at it before, but now you can see it one more time from the inside. It's just a little screw that's pushing against this plate that moves it up and down. There's nothing more to it. So now let's take the float out, and there's a screw right here on the side, and you can't miss it. You can undo that, and that will remove the axle off the float, and you should do this gently because this is sensitive stuff. And here is that axle with the screw where the float is mounted on. So let's put that aside. And then of course inside we have the float. And here it is. Nothing special, just a piece of plastic. So this is the actual float, and if you need to adjust the float level, then you may have to push a bit on this copper lip here, which is pushing against the needle. And we'll talk about the float adjustment in the next video when we go into recondition this carburetor. And the copper part that you see right here is the needle valve that is going to block the fuel coming into the fuel chamber whenever the fuel level is high enough, because it's going to be the float that's going to push against this needle and stop fuel coming in. So let me take out the needle. Be very careful with that, because that's important. And this is the needle, as you can see. That's the part you really replace once you're reconditioning your carburetor. And the needle valve is something you can turn loose and replace it whenever you are reworking the carburetor or reconditioning or rebuilding it. And over here you can also remove this big nut, which is all about the jet. And you can change the jet. The jets are coming in different sizes as well. Now the part we haven't talked about is the choke. And the choke is a part that can rotate inside the housing. And you also have a fast idle, as we call it. So whenever you pull the choke, you also want to give a bit of throttle. So that's why you have this cam. But this can be different on the different types. But the way the HIF carburetor is working is when you rotate this cam here, you're giving it more choke. And when you give it more choke, then what happens is you're going to get some extra fuel coming in through this hole here, which is going to feed inside the carburetor. And I don't know if you can actually see it, but there are two holes there, and that's going to provide extra fuel for your engine and under a choke condition. And that's the only moment in time that the choke is actually affecting anything. It is just enriching the mixture for that moment in time. And that's about all there is to it, to this carburetor. So now that we know on how the carburetor is working, we can actually replay the curve and then talk a bit about what the carburetor was doing and what we can do to adjust it. So let's start when we were running on idle. We had the car running on idle, and it was sitting at around 15, 16 AFR. So way too lean. So that actually means that when we were sitting on idle, we would have to adjust the idle mixture screw. That's that screw right here on the side here, which is going to lower the jet in the middle or raise it depending in which direction we are turning the screw. So if you raise the jet, then you're going to make the mixture leaner. If you lower the jet, you're going to make it richer. So we did not adjust properly the idle mixture. Although I think I did, but it didn't look like it when the engine was hot that it was done correctly. But there could be many different reasons for that. All right. Then we kind of took off in the first gear, and you can see as soon as it depressed the throttle, we were shooting up very high, very lean. In fact, we even had a 23-to-1 AFR, which is totally unacceptable for an acceleration. And I could actually feel it on the car, that the car was hesitating to accelerate. You can also see that shortly after that, it drops down and it becomes a bit more rich, but not extreme. I would have expected a bit more. The richness is only about, I would say, looks like around 13, something like that. And then it goes up lean again. And the only reason I can explain that for the moment is that the actual piston that's inside the carburetor has moved up. So we opened up the throttle, and as soon as we did that, the piston moved up immediately. And it moved up so much that the air velocity dropped. The opening through the carburetor was too big. And because of that, you don't suck in enough volume. And that's what's causing that big peak there. And you see that in the second gear, you see it in the third gear, you see it in the fourth gear. So each time you were trying to accelerate, you see all these peaks coming up, going extra lean. And that's the effect, most likely, of not having a damper which is working properly with the right oil type inside. I know that in the carburetor, when I checked it afterwards, there was very little oil in the damper. So that should reduce that lean peak, and that should bring it down. So we should have a much better air-fuel mixture if the damper is fixed during acceleration moments. You also see that once we got into the cruising mode, we are kind of okay at the 14, I guess 14.7 something Stokio value. That's where you want to be when you're cruising. But I noticed that it's kind of dancing around. I mean, it's really, you see that AFR going up and down. What I suspect is that, again, the damper or the piston was going up and down a bit. It was just playing a bit with me. And that's probably because of the damper not being right, but maybe also because of the spring. That might not be the right spring load on it. So that's something we're going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do when we start tuning it is putting the right oil in making sure that my damper is working right and checking on a curve like this that I don't have those lean peaks anymore when I'm trying to accelerate, and that I have no hesitation of the car. I am not going to go immediately into changing the needle. That's going to be the last thing I'm going to do. But anyway, once we go further down the track here, at one moment in time after cruising, we decided to go wide open. Now, wide open is doing kind of a lot of weird stuff, extremely lean, so it didn't react very well when I did wide open. And when it goes extremely lean, that means that the piston has gone all the way to the top, way too fast. So that's also an effect of the damper, I would say. And then it came down, the piston, very lean, goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down, and it keeps oscillating like this. And I almost suspect that this is a problem with the spring that we have on there. I think that the spring is too soft, not hard enough. It should hold back a bit, because shooting up that lean means that we have the piston moving up immediately all the way to the top, and it shouldn't. It should take a bit of time to get there, and we should have some resistance from the spring for that. And then it kind of immediately dropped back to rich, where we should be. We should be running rich all along here and then climbing back up once we are at speed. And of course, when we backed off, you can actually see that then we went back to a lean mixture. But again, it took a bit of time actually to get lower down enough. So I think really I should go for a stronger spring. That's the kind of indication I would suspect. Now, once I've got the spring sorted out, once I have the damper sorted out, we're going to test again on the car and see how it goes. And then we may still change the needle, because there's many needles we can deal with. But for me, changing the needle, that is kind of a fine-tuning, and we'll do that once we have the car already sorted out to some extent. Sorting out the spring, sorting out the damper, and sorting out the idle air-fuel mixture. So, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did, and if you have any comments, please feel free and do so. I know there's a lot more to be said about these carburetors, and in the next video we're going to do a total rebuild of this carburetor, and then we'll put it in the car and we're going to test it out and tune it. So keep watching, guys, and I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did, and please comment by any means. I hope this was detailed enough for you.